Hi guys, welcome back to Code Master Coach, your medical coding tutor. Guys, we're continuing our review of the 2025 official ICD-10-CM coding guidelines. All right, in my last video, I said that this week we'll be at P, code 094, Sequelae of Complication of Pregnancy, Childbirth, and the Puerperium, and I ask you to think about what sequela means. So I have a note here that says sequela is a condition which is the consequence of a previous disease or injury. So in the case of pregnancy, a sequela is when an initial complication of the obstetric experience develops a sequela that requires care or treatment at a later date. This condition may be described as late effect, which may occur at any time after the postpartum period. So I put a Codemaster Coach note in purple that just says, had you not had the disease or injury while you were pregnant in this case, you would not have this condition today. That's how you know what a sequela is. For example, with pregnancies, if there's a repair of a postpartum perineum prolapse, which is secondary to the traumatic laceration sustained during childbirth, previously, in this case, 2 years earlier, and today they've got this perineum prolapse due to that laceration that the patient received, that is a sequela. However, remember, it cannot be a sequela if the patient is still receiving active treatment for the initial injury or condition. And I like to use the example in class when I'm trying to explain sequela to my students is, yes, it's a late effect. There is no limit of time. It doesn't have to be 6 weeks after, doesn't have to be 6 months after. It could be an example of you working in the kitchen, cutting up, and you cut your finger. And you look at it and you just say, well, I'm going to run some cold water and I'm going to take care of it myself. But after a week or two, you realize it is just not healing on its own. And then you go to the doctor 2 weeks later and he checks it and he says, oh no, it wasn't going to repair on its own because you cut through to the tendon. It was deeper than expected and it requires surgery. So even though you're finally going to the doctor 2 weeks later to get it treated and taken care of, this injury, the cut would not be considered a sequela because you're still receiving active treatment for it. Okay, that initial condition, you're still receiving active treatment for it. Where in this previous example, with the repair of a postpartum perineum prolapse, it says secondary to traumatic laceration sustained during childbirth 2 years earlier. So again, today they've got a problem. They've got a perineum prolapse that was due to traumatic laceration that they had from their childbirth years ago. Now that's a sequela. So I hope that makes sense as far as sequela. All right, so let's look at, we have 1, 2, and 3 for, we're under, yes, P, code 094. And all three of them tell me to go to the guidelines. So looking at our guidelines for sequela of complications of pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, it says code 094, sequela of complications of pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium is for use in those cases when an initial complication of a pregnancy develops a sequela or sequelae requiring care or treatment at a future date. Number 2, after the initial postpartum period, this code may be used at any time after the initial postpartum period. And in sequencing, this code, like all sequela codes, is to be sequenced following the code describing the sequela of the complication. So whatever the problem is today, whether it's that perineum prolapse, that's what they have today. You'll code that first and then identify it as a sequela of a previous traumatic laceration. Okay? So your sequela code is always second. But first you identify what occurred or what's happening today. All right, we're at Q. Let me see if I got any notes for Q. Q is on termination of pregnancies and spontaneous abortions. My note just says that you must distinguish between an encounter for the purpose of performing an elective abortion versus one for dealing with a spontaneous abortion or a complication of an abortion. So make sure I stress this to you. When you spontaneously lose your baby, and I'm saying this from a woman's perspective because I've been there, got pregnant and wanted the baby and lost the baby, and I felt like, oh, I miscarried. Well, in order to properly code it, you have to use the main term abortion. I know it sounds bad. I didn't like it documented in my medical record either. I felt like I wanted this baby. I didn't abort it, but I spontaneously lost the baby on its own, and that's considered a spontaneous abortion. Encounters for the purpose of performing an elective abortion are classified as Z33.2, encounter for elective termination of pregnancy. So, again, let's go to the guidelines. Let's look at 1 and 2 first. Abortion with live-born fetus. When an attempted termination of pregnancy results in a live-born fetus, assign code Z33.2, encounter for elective termination of pregnancy, and the code from category Z37 for outcome of delivery. Because remember, even when the mother goes in at full term to have a baby, we always identify the outcome of delivery. Did she have a single liveborn? Did she have twins, triplets, one stillbirth, one newborn? What was the outcome? Number 2, retain products of conception following an abortion. Subsequent encounters, that's not the initial, but the subsequent encounters for retained products of conception following a spontaneous abortion or elective termination of pregnancy without complications are assigned O03.4, incomplete spontaneous abortion without complication, or code O07.4, failed attempted termination of pregnancy without complication. This advice is appropriate even when the patient was discharged previously with the discharge diagnoses of complete abortion. So remember, at the time she came in, when she aborted, and they thought it was a complete abortion, and later on they found out, nope, there's still some retained products. You still assign these proper coding, O03.4 or O07.4, even if the previous discharge diagnosis was complete abortion. And if the patient has a specific complication associated with the spontaneous abortion or elective termination of pregnancy, in addition to retained products of conception, assign the appropriate complication code, whether it's O03, O04, O07, all of those instead of O03.4 or O07.4, because remember, these are incomplete spontaneous abortion without complication. These are without complication. And 3, complications leading to abortion. Codes from Chapter 15 may be used as additional codes to identify any documented complications of the pregnancy in conjunction with codes in the categories O04, 007, and 008. And I think I've got a note at number 3. Yep. This may include, says here, complications that leading to abortion, embolism, shock, renal failure, venous complications, cardiac arrest, UTIs, etc. Anything that could lead, or complications leading to the abortion. Okay? Let's look at number 4, hemorrhage following elective abortion. For hemorrhage post-elective abortion, assign code O04.6 for delayed or excessive hemorrhage following induced termination of pregnancy. However, do not assign code O72.1 other immediate postpartum hemorrhage, as this code should not be assigned for post-abortion complications. All right, let's make sure my handout, we're up to R. Oh, I have a note for hemorrhage. For pregnancies related conditions, there is an instructional note that states use an additional code from category Z3A for weeks of gestation to identify the specific weeks of the pregnancy if known. This information may not be documented or relevant in cases of non-viable pregnancies. Therefore, category Z3A, those codes should not be assigned for pregnancies with abortive outcomes, elective termination of pregnancy, or for postpartum conditions, as category Z3A is not applicable to these conditions. It's kind of with pregnancies. We know through the 40 weeks of pregnancy, we know when you have to take your glucose tolerance test at a certain week, or we know the stage of the baby at each week along in the pregnancy. But when it leads to a non-viable outcome, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. So code Z3A for the weeks of gestation is irrelevant and should not be coded with abortive outcomes. All right, let's look at abuse in pregnancy. Let's go R. Says for suspected or confirmed cases of abuse of a pregnant patient, a code from subcategories 098.3, physical abuse complicating pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, or 09A4, sexual abuse complicating pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, and code 09A5, psychological abuse complicating pregnancy, childbirth, and puerperium, should be sequenced first, followed by the appropriate code, if applicable, to identify any associated current injury due to physical abuse, sexual abuse, and the perpetrator of abuse. So again, straight from the guidelines as far as abuse in a pregnant patient. Identify what abuse took place, and then that should be, the psychological abuse should be sequenced first, followed by any code that identifies any current injury and then the perpetrator of the abuse. And it goes back again, it just tells you C1, C19, adult and child abuse, neglect, or other maltreatment. In pregnancy, we follow the same guidelines. And are we down to S? Yes, COVID-19 infection in pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, says straight from the guidelines. So S says, during pregnancy or the puerperium, when COVID-19 is the reason for admission or encounter, code 098.5, other viral diseases complicating pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, should be sequenced as the principal or first listed diagnoses, and code U07.1, COVID-19, and the appropriate codes for the associated manifestations should be assigned as additional diagnoses. But remember, codes from chapter 15 always, remember I told you that in the beginning, always take sequencing priority. So if the patient is pregnant, that pregnancy COVID code 098.5 should be sequenced first, followed by the COVID-19 U071 code. All right, and if the reason for the admission or encounter is unrelated to COVID-19, but the patient tests positive for COVID-19 during the admission or the encounter, then the appropriate code for the reason for the admission or encounter should be sequenced as the principal or first listed diagnoses, and a code 098.5 and U071, as well as the appropriate codes for the associated COVID-19 manifestations, should be assigned as additional diagnoses. All right, straight from the guidance, and it follows the COVID-19 coding as well, but just putting the priority back on the pregnancy first. All right, we're down. Next week, we'll be on chapter 16, certain conditions originating in the perinatal period. We're in codes P00 through P96. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks. I will see you in the next one.